What do you want me to do for you? I hope your silent answer when I ask this question isn't hurry up and sit down. So my name's Kieran, I'm one of the leadership team here, and it's a pleasure to speak to you today. It's only the second time I've spoken to the Sunday morning community, so thank you. So that question, what do you want me to do for you? It's the first of two opening questions Jesus asks in our readings today. Jesus asks this question of the blind man Bartimaeus, who is begging at the side of the road and calls out to Jesus. It might be obvious to us what he wants from Jesus, but the question Jesus asks opens up options for Bartimaeus to answer. Jesus doesn't assume what is needed, nor take away his free will or insight into his own situation. What do you want me to do for you? This was a story I thought I was very familiar with until once on a silent retreat I was given this passage to reflect on, and I heard that question profoundly as if for the first time. In the Irish Catholic tradition I grew up with, the message I received was constantly to ask Jesus or God what he wanted of me. It was so much a part of my poor image of myself and of God that I would even pray a different question, that of the man possessed by spirits we hear from earlier in Mark's Gospel. Now that voice says, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" In that question, the speaker seems small, insignificant, and fearful, and God is powerful and distant and to be feared. The spirit who asks that question continues, "In God's name, do not torture me." So for myself, someone who feared God in that life-limiting sense of expecting negative consequences, not the true biblical sense of awe and wonder, to hear Jesus ask me, "What do you want me to do for you?" was radical and life-changing. I began to experience that perhaps I'd misunderstood John the Baptist's belief about Jesus, that he must become greater and I must become less. I realized that Jesus' question is a call to life in all its fullness for everyone. Truly to reflect the image of God in which I am created, I need to be open in my answer to Jesus' question, so that I can become all that I am able to be with God's help, trusting in his infinite, unconditional, intimate love expressed fully in the life of Jesus. It's about being and bringing my whole self and saying, as the blind beggar does, "I want to see." To see with the eyes of self-giving love and to give to others and to God as freely as I have received. And so to our second question. Jesus asks, "What were you talking about as you walked along?" It's the same day that Jesus is found to be missing from his tomb. Two disciples meet a stranger as they leave Jerusalem. They don't know it's Jesus. Now, he could have played it differently. Jesus didn't ask that rhetorical question, that pompous question we might hear from a privileged celebrity in our time. "Do you not know who I am?" Expecting the answer, "Oh yes, of course, you're wonderful." No, that's not Jesus' style, is it? This stranger asks a question which enables the two companions to tell their story and in the process interpret for themselves their experience of what we've come to know as the first Easter. One companion responds with a question in surprise. Are you the only person who didn't know? And still Jesus responds with another question. "What do you mean?" After they share what they know and believe, Jesus asks more questions, this time more challenging. "Why can't you understand? How can you be so slow to believe all the prophets said? Didn't you know that the Messiah would have to suffer before he was given his glory?" So as I imagine it, Jesus' tone of voice is not telling off. It's as a caring teacher or a loving parent might prompt a reluctant child or someone who may be slow to see what's before them. Their conversation is so fruitful that they invite Jesus to stay with them, and they come to know him not only through his words but especially through his actions as he blesses and breaks the bread. A simple act of self-giving love which we still recreate today. A few weeks ago, when the story of Emmaus was the Gospel reading for the Sunday, I saw a simple summary of this story on Twitter. And for those of you who don't use Twitter, you can only type a short message of 140 letters and spaces. Very brief summary of this story. The Emmaus story is a microcosm of Christianity. Journey making and bread making in community makes us more susceptible to see Jesus. Journey making, bread making in community. That's why we're here today. The precise location of the place called Emmaus is unknown. I believe there's at least 4 places in the Holy Land that lay claim to being the Emmaus. There is even some doubt whether it's a real place. Now we know the name of one of the travellers, but the other is also unknown, perhaps deliberately so. Maybe Luke intends for us to know that this is an encounter that could take place anywhere, with anyone. So it's more than just what the theologian James Allison calls a slightly weird miracle story. He believes that there's didn't want it to be just another place that people would venerate as a shrine and think that's the sacred place. But actually, this is a sacred event that could happen anywhere. So James Allison is a theologian I much admire. In his introduction to Christianity called Jesus the Forgiving Victim, he shows how Jesus helps the travellers to see the story of the resurrection and the law and the prophets through Jesus' eyes. He doesn't do this with the 11 disciples. He doesn't give them the authoritative interpretation of what happens. James Allison said that in Luke's account, Jesus shows us that anyone can share their experience and insight, and that it can be valued and confirmed by the community. When the travellers go to see the 11 apostles, they each share their stories with one another, and all are enriched by the experience. There's no sense of hierarchy about that. Allison also believes that Jesus isn't just playing dumb in asking, "What do you mean?" Instead, Jesus is recognising, as in the words of James Allison, that these guys are never going to understand what was going on except through the act of trying to tell their own story. Jesus recognises the power of story to give meaning and value to our questions. So in another place, when the expert of law asks, "Who is my neighbour?" Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan and asks the questioner to answer his own question, to interpret the story for himself. The Emmaus story is about Jesus showing us how to interpret our stories through his eyes, through the lens of his life and teaching. Allison continues, later on the disciples describe their experience of undergoing this act of interpretation by saying, in another translation it's written, "Did not our hearts burn within us?" They knew they were being told the truth, and hearing it was turning upside down who they thought they were and how they thought they belonged. They were being re-narrated into being, retelling their story. They think of Jesus as the outsider who didn't understand. Did you not know? In dialogue, they reach a deeper shared understanding. They welcome Jesus into their home, and yet Jesus becomes the host. The tables are turned as he blesses and breaks the bread, not the one who invited Jesus in. Jesus echoes an Old Testament vision of God revealing himself, and then is gone from their sight. He is no longer the stranger interpreting the story of the Messiah in the third person. He's no longer saying, "This is what the Old Testament said about the Messiah. This is what the law and prophets said about the Messiah." He's become I am. It's him. They've come to know him as Jesus, as God. And I am, as you may recall, is the name of God revealed to Moses in the Old Testament. He's no longer telling a story of someone else. He's telling his story and helping them to see their story in his. Allison says, the unrecognisable third person is no longer a third party outside them, but the very source within them of who they are and what they are coming to be. This was a story I also thought I knew well, but in hearing James Allison's insights, I experienced something like what the disciples describe in another translation as our hearts burning within us. When you hear someone's insight into a story as if you'd never read it before, it is very exciting and inspiring. In the story of Emmaus, Alison writes that Luke has given us the framework for the ordinary experience of what it is to be a Christian, and to have your text, your story, and thus your very self interrupted and reinterpreted for you by the crucified and risen Lord. So there's just a couple of examples of the questions that Jesus asks that turn our experience round. So changing the questions we ask changes the answers we receive. It changes how we see our situation and that of others. I felt inspired to suggest that this month we reflect on the theme Appreciating Church. That came from the experience that we went through as a community 2 years ago. And the story of that experience is told in a book called Appreciating Church, which is published in February this year. Appreciating Church is about using the techniques of appreciative inquiry to help us value, nurture and grow our community. If you're not familiar with what appreciative inquiry or AI is, one of the originators of AI, David Cooperrider, defines it as a process of engaging people in building a world they want to live in. Working from people's strengths and positive experiences, AI co-creates a future based on collaboration and open dialogue. It's about questions, it's about listening, it's about appreciating one another's story. At the heart of AI is the appreciative conversation, which invites us to focus on what is positive, constructive and life-giving, and helps us to reframe our reflection on our questions and challenges and find a new interpretation of our story. So 2 weeks ago, on Pentecost, Tim demonstrated this by asking us, what do you appreciate about church? And why is St. Bride's important to you? So if you weren't here that Sunday and you'd like to see what people said, we've got a record of all the contributions that were made to that discussion. So that's there for those who would like to share that. Then last week, Kate also asked us to look around and see what qualities we can see in each other and in the fertile soil that is the community of St. Bride's. The words of our morning prayer last week were taken from the appreciative conversations we shared 2 years ago when the community of St. Bride's lived through what I believe was an Emmaus-like time of transformation. Little did we know when we planned to gather in September 2015 for a day called Reimagining St. Bride's, Creating Our Future Together, that we would learn just a few days before that the Heritage Lottery Fund grant application was nowhere near enough to repair and restore our building. Like the disciples in the Emmaus story, there was a real temptation to feel sad and gloomy. The task of raising much more to make our dream a reality seemed overwhelming. People felt stuck and began to consider walking away from what felt like a huge burden of responsibility. And we began to grieve at the thought of letting go of this building. When we got into small groups to dream what achievements we would celebrate in 7 years from that day, one group was unable to imagine a future at all with a question mark hanging over the building. So I asked them to imagine they were writing a design brief for an architect which described what space we wanted to create and how we would use it. That released them from their block and enabled them to imagine a bright future. So we took what we learned from the AI process and asked some questions. Not, what will we do with the building? Or, what will we do without the building? Those were questions that were focused on the problem as we saw it. More profoundly, we asked, what is God's work in this parish? What ministries would support that work? What resources would be required to support those ministries? As a result of our shared conversation around those questions, the community went through a transformation from downcast to uplifted, daring to dream that a new vision of our community can enable us to reimagine our future together and to reimagine our place in this building, this neighbourhood, this parish and this city in new and exciting ways. And these insights also informed us when our former rector, Guy, moved on last year, and we discerned together what we would look for in a new rector. The dream continues and the questions are still valid today as we reimagine and regenerate this building and look forward to a new journey accompanied by our new rector. So finally, before we move into our time of prayer, I have a question for you. This is not a question that I need you to respond to right now or out loud. This is a question for you to reflect on. I'm going to ask you to pass those on so that perhaps you might want to take it away and reflect on it in your own time as well. We'll take a few minutes with it now. So the question is, if you were having an appreciative conversation with Jesus, what would be the first question you ask? And just to help you to remember, an appreciative conversation is about focusing on what's life-giving, what's positive, what's constructive, what's hopeful. It's not ignoring any challenges that there may be, but it's about asking the question in a way that might change the way we see the situation. And so you will see on the bottom of that handout a little cartoon. I've given away my one. And the cartoon is an example of a question which gets an unexpected answer. Oh Lord, why do you allow so much suffering in the world? And the Lord says, funny, I was just about to ask you the same thing. So that's not an example of an appreciative conversation. It's the question is that type of question is a bit like us saying, what are we going to do with this building, or what are we going to do without the building? It's focused on a problem. So how might that question be reframed into a more appreciative or a more positive or hopeful question? So this is something. Perhaps can you think of an example? How might that person rephrase that question? So they're still acknowledging their concern for suffering. Any thoughts?
What can I do to help alleviate?
Yeah, help me to see. Or, yes, like the blind man, help me to see. How can I help? What can I do? So still honouring your concern for the challenges in the world, acknowledging that you feel helpless even. So being real and honest, but reframing it, transforming it into something more hopeful, more active, more life-giving. So I shall leave that question with you, and we'll have a few moments of silence before we move into a time of prayer. Thank you.